Rolling along with our next preview, that is the Alabama Crimson Tide, and Dalton is going to look a lot different this year. No longer is the greatest coach of all time roaming the sidelines for the Crimson Tide and Nick Saban. He retired after 17 seasons at Alabama that included 7 national championships as well. They replaced him with Kalen DeBoer, who is a really good coach, right? You led Washington to the national championship game last year. He's won 104-12 is his record as a head coach in college football right now. So I think it's a great hire, honestly. I think it's as good of a hire as Alabama could have hoped for. It's going to look a lot different as DeBoer is a offensive guru, whereas Nick Saban is one of the greatest defensive coaches we've ever seen in the sport of football. So it's going to be interesting, man, with Kalen DeBoer and what he does with Jalen Milroe this year, who might have the best tools of any quarterback in America as well. So I'm really excited to see if he can develop the way that Michael Penix Jr. developed under Kalen DeBoer. But there are some questions for the Crimson Tide that we'll get into later on. But one of them is definitely not offensive line, man. This offensive line is freaking stupid, Dawn. It might be the best interior offensive line I've seen maybe ever as a college football fan, man. I've been alive for 25 years now. I have not seen an interior offensive line that is this good than the one that Alabama has. And we'll talk about one guy in particular later on in the video, but I rank the top 10 interior offensive linemen, which means guards and centers, combine them into one list. All 3 of their starting interior offensive linemen are in the top 7 of that list. So you got the best center in the country, Parker Brailsford, one of the best guards in the country as well, and Tyler Booker, who, by the way, NFL Stock Exchange are one of our good friends at PFF. They ranked him as the number 1 interior offensive lineman in the draft, and both Trevor and Connor said they think he's going to be a first-round pick in the NFL draft as well, Tyler Booker. The other one, Jaden Roberts, the other guard, they said is like the Incredible Hulk, man. He's probably the strongest player in college football right now. So I think all 3 of them are among the best in the country at their positions. So that offensive line. And then also, I didn't mention this before, Caden Proctor played a lot better down the stretch last year as a true freshman left tackle for them. He transferred to Iowa this offseason, then transferred back to Alabama. He's a former top 10 recruit as well. I think he's going to be maybe a first-round pick in the 2026 NFL draft. So you got potential first-round tackle in Caden Proctor, 3 outstanding interior offensive linemen, and then you have Elijah Pritchett as your right tackle, who was a former top 35 recruit in his class as well. So this offensive line, in my opinion, Dalton, is the best offensive line that we have in college football right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's just loaded with talent, and as always, they're huge. And I think a big thing is Kalen DeBoer. He knows that the offensive line is that important. Washington had a top 5 offensive line last year. The part where they may struggle, right, and where that line is going to need to buy time for Jalen Milroe is who are we throwing to here, right? Because we lost Ja'Cory Brooks, we lost Isaiah Bond, we lost Amari Niblack. Like, right now, Alabama's top 3 receivers combined last year for less than 900 yards. So Jeremy Bernard, a Washington transfer who came with DeBoer, he had just 430 yards last year as Washington's number 4 receiver, right? Because they were just so stacked. There is a lot of inexperience at wide receiver and at tight end. They're going to still lean heavily. I know we think about DeBoer and his offense and Michael Penix and being explosive down the field, but there has got to be a real question mark right now about whether or not they can get vertical and who's going to get open and how talented they are, especially at wide receiver, I think, right? They're going to be able to run the ball behind that line, but do they have enough weapons around Jalen Milroe? And pivoting to Milroe here, obviously our quarterback spotlight, he's an interesting character because you've got a guy who physically has the tools that he probably could win a Heisman Trophy, right? He could put up the traditional numbers if he's got the weapons around him. Second best big-time throw rate in the country. Second most rushing yards from scrambles last year behind Jaden Daniels, right? 3.44 second average time to throw, though, is massive. The highest among quarterbacks last year with 150 dropbacks. He's a big play machine, no question. And the fact that he has that offensive line to buy all that time for him makes him incredibly dangerous. We saw in the Auburn game with the fourth and 31, right, down in the end zone that saved their season, and all the scrambling, and he could easily run for 1,000 yards. And he makes all these big plays while still protecting the football reasonably well. A 2.8% turnover-worthy play rate is, it's not a top-of-the-line mark, but it's a solid mark considering how much he's throwing the ball downfield. Now, the question is going to be, with the combination of the receivers needing to be able to separate an inexperienced group of receivers, right? and Milroe holding the football we saw in their playoff game against Michigan and even a little bit against Georgia, right? Well, Georgia kind of had a double spy strategy going of like, don't let him run. But I would be more concerned with what Michigan did and blitzing him at a very, very high rate, okay? He does. 3.44 seconds on average is way too long. You can survive around 3, maybe even 3.1. 3.5 seconds to be your average is way too long. He's going to have to speed up the process, or he's going to get SEC defenses adjusting to, okay, let's blitz him 60% of the time. Let's press these receivers, and let's see if he can find somebody in 2 to 2.5, right? That was a problem in their playoff game against Michigan. If Milroe can speed up the process sometimes, and I think DeBoer can teach him some of that, right? Even as much as even DeBoer wants to get the ball out vertically, even Michael Penix Jr. last year, for as much as they threw the ball downfield, he got rid of it, right? If he can teach Milroe that, you've got a potential Heisman contender. But the combination of his process being a bit slow and these new receivers now that aren't as talented as the group he had last year would concern me a little bit.
Yeah, it would, man. And I'm glad you brought up the average time to throw, because I'm sure when we broke down the offensive line, how I think is the best in the country, how we both think is the best in the country, people are like, wait a minute, they allowed out so many sacks last year. Like, what are you guys talking about? So much of that was Jalen Milroe's fault, man. So much of that was him holding on to the ball forever and not getting rid of that football. So I don't think the offensive line deserved a lot of the blame for last year. I think a lot of it had to do with, it's like the Caleb Williams thing. USC's offensive line was actually pretty damn good with Caleb Williams. The problem was Caleb Williams held onto the ball forever, and it made it look like he was under pressure all the time, when really it was because of him, not really because of the offensive line's faults of their own. So I'm glad you broke that down, because I think that's an important caveat. I'm sure a lot of people watching this right now is like, why is the offensive line the best in the country when they were allowing so many sacks last year? It's because Jalen Milroe was holding on to the ball for so long, and also because of the addition they made of Parker Brailsford from Washington, who we think is the best center in college football right now. As a redshirt freshman last year, he was the second most valuable center in the country. He had the 80.7 run blocking grade. That was second best among Power 5 centers, only behind Jackson Powers Johnson, who was the best center in college football last year. Parker Brailsford, man, really elite athlete, led all FBS centers with a 90.7 grade on zone runs. The issue with him, and I think Trevor and Connor did a great job breaking this down in their interior offensive line video for summer scouting, which you should go check out. He is 275 pounds. That is tiny. Tiny, tiny, tiny. That is like 10 pounds less than what Jason Kelce was playing at. And Jason Kelce is the poster boy for an undersized center in the NFL. So Parker Brailsford, that was the thing that he really broke down, was that Trevor was like, man, he's either going to be Jason Kelce or he's going to be out of the league immediately, because there's no in between. There is no in between for him. And like, I think Aaron Brewer, the center for the Titans, is the only one who's that small playing center in the NFL. So he is a really, really skinny center. That's going to be really interesting to see how he holds up in the SEC and also holds up in the NFL, obviously, later on in his career. But, man, he is such a dominant player. And it shows that Trevor and Connor still consider him to be one of the top interior linemen in the draft, even though he's such a massive outlier in his size because of how damn good his tape is, honestly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that's going to be a fun argument. We're going to see. You look, in the SEC, there's no better test in college football, right, than all these monster defensive tackles. You've got guys 340, 350, 360 that play in the SEC across from him.
And you got Tyler Booker and Jaden Roberts, who are like two massive human beings next to him. So at least they can help out with that, right?
It's gonna be a fun visual actually to see them all together, isn't it? Just when they show the end zone shots of like the three of them, and it's like this, like it's gonna look a little funny. But he's a great player, no question. And I'll tell you, we've yet to talk about Alabama's defense. So much has been about DeBoer and Milroe on the offense, but you're losing Nick Saban. You're losing maybe the greatest defensive coach of all time, and he spawned so many other, including Kirby Smart, so many other great defensive coaches. But they lost some defensive talent too. And one guy they did lose was the best safety in the country, in Caleb Downs. But I'll tell you what, if you're going to go in the portal and replace a Caleb Downs, you could do a lot worse than Keon Sabb back here, right? Great year at Michigan last year. A big part of their national title winning defense. One of 6 Power 5 safeties who got an 80-plus grade in coverage and run defense. He didn't play a ton, right? Michigan rotates a lot of guys, rotating in and out with Rod Moore and Makari Page and guys like that. But this is a guy who they could really build their secondary around. They're going to have a really, really young secondary next year, and he's going to get much more playing time than he did last year. He was outside the top 150 in playing time last year among safeties. So he's going to have to get used to the workload, but despite being outside the top 150 in playing time, he's the third most forced incompletions among Power 5 safeties. So he's a playmaker. He's really aggressive to the ball. And if you're going to lose to Caleb Downs, Keon Sabb coming in is about as good as you can do back there. Alabama's secondary is going to be a key unit to watch for this team, and we'll see if they don't get themselves in some shootouts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a thing that makes me feel a little bit better about the secondary and why that wasn't their biggest weakness when we broke that down was because of the safeties and Keon Sabb and Malachi Moore, man. But the corner situation, man, I'm a little worried. I'm worried because Damani Jackson, who was a former 5-star recruit at USC, has never really showed that, even though he's a really physically talented player. He transfers over. He'll be one of the starting outside corners. And they have a true freshman at the other outside corner, man, is Zabian Brown, who's probably going to be the other starter. And then behind him are like redshirt freshmen and true freshmen as well. So they have a young cornerback room at Alabama right now, which is a very concerning thing for the Crimson Tide. But I think the safeties of Malachi Moore and Keon Sabb and even Devontae Smith as the nickel corner will be good for them to help them out, help out the new corners at Alabama. But bottom line time now, Dalton. Obviously, big shoes to fill for Kalen DeBoer in his first year as Alabama's head coach. How will he do? What are your expectations for the Crimson Tide heading into this year? And do you think there's too many weaknesses on this team and too many holes on this team that they won't be one of the top teams in college football? Or do you think this is still one of the best teams and they should still be one of the top teams from the national championship?
I don't believe they're going to contend for a national title, in all likelihood, unless Milroe just hits another gear and DeBoer, and it all just fits perfectly. I do think this is one of the harder evaluations in the country because of what you have leaving and Saban and some other guys. But what you have coming in is really good, too. Kalen DeBoer is one of the best coaches in the country. They managed to keep Jalen Milroe, but despite a bunch of other guys leaving. I'm kind of running off the assumption that the SEC is going to get like 4 playoff teams, right? And I think personally Georgia and Ole Miss are going to be right in that mix, okay? When we look at those other 2 spots, I think you look at a list of teams, Alabama, Missouri, maybe LSU if things gel with Nussmeier.
Texas.
I think you've got a next set of teams that could make the playoffs, right? Maybe a 10-2 and get in the playoffs, 10, 11, 12 spot. I think it makes a lot of sense for Alabama to set the playoff as the goal this year. I don't think they're an inner circle national title contender like they were every year with Saban, but I think the playoff is a realistic goal if they can figure out everything, both things we've talked about on the perimeter, at receiver and at corner especially. If they figure those 2 things out and piece it all together and Milroe has a big-time year, they can have playoff expectations. I'm not putting them in the national title circle. I don't think they're going to win the whole thing. But they could be, if the SEC is going to get 4, maybe even 5 playoff teams, I could very well see them being one of those 4 or 5.
Absolutely. Yeah, you look at their schedule right now. They play Georgia late September, so that'll be a huge game at Alabama as well. They play Missouri. They play Tennessee, LSU, Oklahoma. Like, those are some tough games on the schedule. So I think they're going to be favored probably in every single one of those games besides the Georgia game. So if you go by that, it'd be 11-1 season. But I think, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Alabama does next year. I still think it's a top 5 or 6 team in the country. Don't get me wrong. I think you could put them right around that range. But I agree with you. I think the playoffs should be the expectation, and fans, I know it's weird for Alabama fans because every year they want a national title, but playoffs should be a very good thing. And also, Kalen DeBoer, man, is killing it in recruiting. That's one thing he didn't really do that well at Washington, and really it's a hard thing to do at Washington. He's killing it in recruiting, man. So I have zero doubt that he's going to turn Alabama again into a national title contender, but there's a lot of new moving parts on this team right now, and because of the questions in the receiving core, because of the questions at cornerback, I just have a little more, and no Nick Saban, obviously, which is a almost impossible task to replace him, no matter how good your replacement is. It's going to be interesting. I think if DeBoer and Milroe form an elite partnership, which I think they can, then yeah, they could absolutely be a national title contender. But it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch next year. But by the way, like I said before in these other videos, we are doing this for every single Power 4 team, all 70 of them heading into 2024. So make sure you guys subscribe to the channel, and we got more videos coming as well besides these previews. So that's what we got for the Alabama Crimson Tide 2024 season preview.